This Thursday marks the 74th anniversary of Korea's liberation from Japanese colonial rule. And so we're taking this week's Touch Base in Seoul to talk about Joseph Juhn, the director of a documentary film called JERONIMO, The Untold Tales of Koreans in Cuba. It's an extraordinary story of Koreans who fled the nation to escape from Japanese rule, and after some terrible circumstances in Mexico, a small group ended up settling in Cuba and even became players in the Cuban Revolution. But the community still kept their Korean culture and heritage intact to this day. The music you're hearing now is in fact the documentary film's theme song, titled 고향의 봄, or Spring in My Hometown, a song that many Koreans know by heart. I'm very glad to say that we have Joseph on the show today. Welcome.
Thank you. Thanks for inviting me.
So this documentary film all started actually from a backpacking trip to Cuba, correct?
That's correct, yes. 4 years ago.
So that's in 2015. Can you tell us about how you came about making this film then?
Yeah, so I guess, what really truly sparked my interest in this documentary project actually doesn't start from the Cuba trip alone, but my interest in the notion of Korean diaspora in general. As a Korean American myself, I was born in the States, but I grew up in Korea. I went back to the US when I was 18. So as all American born or, anyone who goes to the US at a relatively later age goes through, I also went through what's called, identity crisis myself. And in college, I learned about the Los Angeles riots in 1992, and that really gave me a firm sense of what it means to be a Korean outside of Korea. So, and I have many other instances that I'm happy to share with you down the road. But yes, I went to Cuba. I met, by sheer chance, a Korean descendant who, as was introduced, whose grandfather fled from Korea in 1905. And I had no knowledge of Koreans in Cuba at all.
Right. So
I was fascinated by their family history, and one thing led to another. I didn't know it was going to be a 3-year project, but here I am. I've completed a full feature film.
As you said, you didn't know about these Korean community in Cuba. I think most Koreans, even in Korea, wouldn't know about these people. The focus of your documentary is on a man called Geronimo Lim. His Korean name is Im Eun-jo, and you labeled him as the Korean Che Guevara. Can you share with us, our listeners, who Geronimo Im was and what impact he had on this Korean Cuban society?
Sure. So I used to pronounce his name Geronimo. Being an American, I am, but
Herónimo.
It's what I've been corrected multiple times by the family members as I was interviewing. So the Korean Che could be a misleading name just because that's how I initially envisioned this guy to be, a Korean who fought in the Cuban Revolution. When I presented that title to the family members, all of them said, yeah, our father is great, but he's no Che. Che is almost like a divine figure in Cuba. When I presented that same title to my American counterparts, they said, hey, you're comparing this Korean hero to a murderer, a revolutionary who fought for communism. So I quickly dropped that name, and no longer do I refer to him as Korean Che, but yes, he went to law school with Fidel Castro. And then he worked with Che Guevara at some point in his government career. And, he fought in the Cuban Revolution as the only Korean ethnic person. So I think in that regard, the title is apt, but it's long gone. So he was a Korean Cuban revolutionary. And the idea that, I used to grow up reading Motorcycle Diaries by Che, and I used to, at some point, idolize him. But this idea that, there's this Korean guy who fought, maybe not alongside physically, but with Che in spirit, really blew me away. Yeah.
Right, the fact that there is a Korean connection there, we would have never thought. Sure. And that must have driven why you made this film. But still, to explain a little bit about your background, you were actually a lawyer, who was working full-time in,
Past tense.
You were a lawyer, but you were a lawyer back then, and then you quit your job and put everything down, decided to make this film after this trip to Cuba. How do you make that jump? How do you decide to do that?
There's a big regret now for having made that decision. I'm only half kidding, but as I said, I didn't envision that this small passion project will turn into a 3-year journey in life. And when I stopped practicing law, I thought at most this is going to be a 1-year passion project, right? It ended up being more than 2.5 years, close to now. I think it was, everyone says it sounds cliche, but they talk about how, on your deathbed, can you recount some of the events at which you regret that you didn't actually end up doing? For me, it was one of those moments because I've never felt more passionate after meeting this family that if I were to never tell this story and just keep it as my cool experience, how wasteful would that encounter be? So for me at the time, I was just really, I was so captivated with their story, and it was a natural decision for me. A lot of people ask me now, hey, how did you go from being a lawyer to a storyteller? I'm like,
because you never made a film before, right?
I've never made a film to this extent, with this scale. I did study film back in undergrad, so
Okay.
I knew like the basic level, although I have to learn everything, from the beginning. But yeah, this is my first feature documentary film. Yeah. And, going from lawyer, yes, I didn't know it was going to be this difficult. I didn't know it was going to be this long. And I didn't make a career switch necessarily. It was a passion project. I still have a desire to go back and practice, mainly because of survival issue. Yeah, I really had to, break my banks and just really give everything that I have to make this dream a reality. Yeah.
From hearing you talk about this, I feel this film is very, how do I say, personal rather than politically motivated. As in, for example, when you say Korean chairs, you say, there are a lot of political images that come up when we talk about Korean, independence fighters and people who left Korea from the Japanese colonial rule. There might be that Korean slant about it, but for you, this is about Korean culture and Korean identity surviving in this most foreign and difficult of circumstances. Is that right?
No, absolutely. I think you're on point in mentioning that, I wouldn't even call this, I wouldn't even say that I was motivated by the sense of a national culture or national identity. I think ultimately what I was going after was this sense of identity, which is a universal theme, right? Irrespective of where you come from, everyone has to at some point go through your sense of dual or multi-identity, especially living in America as a minority, right? For me, that was important because, as I have alluded to in the opening, I've always been interested in this notion of Korean diaspora, Koreans who live outside of Korea and have this yearning to, if not return, then to have some sort of connection to the motherland of where their ancestors came from, right? So for me, it's a journey to find oneself and one's home away from homeland, right? And in that sense, it's not even really about Korean identity. It's more universal than that. But contextually, this is about a Korean man who struggled with his identity. So yes, but any sense of politics or nationalism, I try to stay away from as much as possible.
Unfortunately, I've not seen the film myself. I'm very much looking forward to seeing it when it comes out. But I'm here in Korea. But from the clips I've seen online or from your website, it's fascinating because there are these third or fourth, fifth generation Cuban Koreans who still speak Korean and who still know about Korean culture. That's incredible, right? That must have been what you felt like when you saw it.
Absolutely, and thanks to BTS, Lee Min-ho, and all the Korean celebrities, they are sort of reclaiming their identity, which actually had been lost for close to 50 years because, Cuba went through a socialist revolution, right? And under communism or socialism, advocating for one's cultural backgrounds or ethnic roots is prohibited strictly. So there was actually a period where Korean identity was gone for 30, 40 years. But it was indeed Heronimo Lim who had a chance to visit Korea. And then after he came back, he said, okay, this is our collective mission. This is my personal mission, is to revive and be empowered and be proud of where we come from. Yeah.
The film has had several screens in the US, as we talked about, and it will be broadcast on Korean television, KBS 1, on Thursday. What has been the reaction been so far to your film?
A lot of Korean Americans were able to empathize with the immigration story, but their version, Korean Cuban version, is much more dramatized and, it's much more dramatic than, the recent Korean immigrants to the U.S., right? So I think, their reactions were both curious, interested, shocked, moved, and touched, I think. That's the general reaction of Koreans in Cuba, Koreans in America, who can, empathize with the story of immigration. But I am curious about how Korean audiences will react.
Right. That was going to be my next question. How do you think they will react? How do you think they will take this film?
Chang-ho, what do you think of Koreans' general notion of Korean diaspora is? Do you think it's positive or negative?
Well, as always with these things, for me, it's a grey area. There are good things and there are bad things. I think they want to embrace Koreans from overseas as well, but they don't know how. Perhaps
I think so. I think you're completely right, and I look to Jewish for a role model or a good example. How there's obviously a rift between Jewish in the homeland and Israel and people living in the diaspora, but they understand that they have to coexist, that they have to embrace each other for them to survive even. But I think Koreans significantly lack that sense of camaraderie. I think Koreans living outside of Korea is generally looked down upon and is negatively perceived. Like, Korean ethnic Chinese, North Korean defector, you name it. I mean, just the first image that comes to Koreans in Korea is just not so positive. Even Korean Americans, right? They're opportunistic or they're out there for their own, survival. Yoo Seung-jun, perfect case and example, although, that's another issue. So I wanted to highlight the stories, the unsung heroes who live outside of Korea, who really tried hard to form that sense of connection with the people of the homeland and the homeland itself.
Right. I mean, as a Korean British myself, I've experienced some of these things as well. For me, what definitely helped is because I speak Korean, I think there's definitely a more warming embrace. But for those who don't, there is definitely a barrier that Korean people seem to have when it comes to the Korean diaspora. I do understand what you mean. Perhaps not as harsh as you might have portrayed it in my experience, but then again, obviously, experiences range and vary. And this Cuban story, Cuban-Korean community story is fascinating. We've been speaking to Joseph Juhn, the director of JERONIMO, or 헤로니모, as shall I say, 헤로니모, The Untold Tales of Koreans in Cuba, which will be airing on KBS 1 in Korea on Thursday. Joseph, it's been great to talk to you, and good luck for that TV screening in Korea.
Thank you so much.